Richard Grannon, we're here again.
Here we go.
Here again.
In the flesh, I think, for the first time that we've done
We
podcast.
No, because I did one with you, didn't I?
That's right. Of course,
yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, you inspired me to do face-to-face. But a lot's happened, I think, since the last time we spoke, or the last time at least you were on my podcast.
Yeah.
I've been on quite a journey into Jung and Nietzsche, but more like into journey with psychologists and psychology and philosophers. And, I've been speaking to professors and PhDs and completely out of my depth. But, it's been an interesting
Well, you're
exploration.
You're getting the good side of psychology, the
Yeah.
interesting side of psychology. There's a lot of shite in psychology as well, but
Yeah.
you've done it the right way.
Okay.
That's why when people come to me and they say, "Should I get a degree in psychology?" I'm always like, I don't know. It's a fascinating subject. Nietzsche considered himself a psychologist. So when we say psychologist, I always what are you talking about? Where if it's directed towards an end goal, it's a fantastic tool. As an academic subject in and of itself, I think it's a bit of a damp squib.
Bit of a waste of time. Yeah, it's kind of like it's interesting to try and find out where it came from, because it's a relatively new discipline, isn't it? And it came from philosophy.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like an offshoot of philosophy.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it kind of replaced the role of the priest in the community, which who you would go to and confess your sins or your problems, and they would give you spiritual guidance as well as psychological guidance. But the psychologists of today have had the spiritual side removed, if you like, and it's very much a mechanistic ideology that's running.
And when I went to university to study psychology when I was 18, I'd started looking at psychology at age 13. My dad bought me the Dale Carnegie book, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Yeah.
So I went down. I was already into some spirituality and the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later known as Osho, and Buddhism and Hinduism, some of those concepts, and personal development style psychology, which is when I was 14, 15 years old, I didn't realize it wasn't psychology that was academic, and it was very American. And so when I went to university and they're like, okay, this is a Bachelor of Science in Behavioral Psychology, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds cool. Behavior, yeah, I'll study behavior. I didn't realize how restrictive it was going to be. Because if they couldn't observe it, they weren't interested. Freud, Jung, Nietzsche, an absolute joke in that university environment. I had lecturers laugh at me because I said I wanted to discuss or look at psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. So they just stayed within that Pavlov, Skinner. We got a little bit of Chomsky. All the stuff that I personally find so dry, it's obvious. I don't find deep insight in behavioral psychology. I'm not impressed by behavioral psychology. I don't know.
So just it gives a little elaborate on behavioral psychology, and especially Pavlov, because I think Pavlov is the work that he discovered with the dogs and the subsequent people who followed him is quite dark and cynical. What the results were in terms of conditioning people's behaviour through subtle cues that we may or may not know that we're subject to. And I think that's something that is generally overlooked and not really examined. Because we have something at the moment in the government called the Nudge Department. You heard of them?
I've never heard of that. That sounds sinister.
It is sinister, right? So the Nudge Department will have a government policy or a government agenda, and they know that people may not accept that policy off the bat, so they nudge them towards that goal.
Right.
And they'll use behavioural cues in order to get people to go to the goal without knowing that they've been persuaded or nudged to get there, and it's based upon behavioural science and Pavlov.
I'm fairly moderate, as you know me. I'm fairly moderate, fairly centrist in my views, generally speaking, when it comes to politics. But I would be considered more of an extremist. That should be illegal.
Yeah.
That should absolutely be illegal.
Yeah.
Psychology is a kind of Pandora's box, and some of these things need to go back in the box. If people wouldn't naturally think that way, you can't use Freudian principles or Pavlovian principles to nudge them to change their behavior. That absolutely has to stop. But then the counter argument would be, well, where do you stop nudging people? Is advertising too much? And it's a conversation we will need to have eventually. Like, how are we using psychology and where's it going? And should we restrict it? Because there's understanding human nature and then there's manipulating human nature. Well, extortion, exploitation, threat, seduction, con artistry are all illegal. When does psychology offer us a soft legal mode of doing exactly the same things: seduction, extortion, exploitation, blackmail, and all the rest of it, and terrorizing people, quite frankly. So the behavioral view looks at the human being as an animal machine, and it's only interested in what can be objectively observed. If it happens internally or subjectively, they completely disregard it. That's the simplest way of describing behavioral psychology. And I, quite frankly, don't think it's not useless. I think it's an important part of psychology. Putting rats in T-shaped mazes and trying to determine whether they're going to go left or right, whether they get a pain or a pleasure, it's necessary. But you're almost bordering into neurobiology there. Yeah. That's more of a biological issue, in my opinion. So I think we should follow the scientific method in psychology, but I'm more of the philosophy end of psychology. I think if we're going to study psychology, we should accept in all due humility that I'm a human being, and that when I study you as a human being, you're not a rat, you're not a dog. I'm not a higher order being than you. And it's using human consciousness to explore human consciousness is like a torch beam that's trying to shine its light back on its own. It can't do it.
It's like circular reasoning, isn't it?
Well, inevitably circular reasoning crops up, logical fallacies crop up, cognitive biases crop up, because how couldn't they? In a certain sense that psychology currently doesn't want to accept. I am you and you are me. So when I sit there in my pompous little, modality going, well, Mr. Easeman clearly demonstrates I can only understand that through my own personal experience. If I say you have mother issues or father issues, how did I recognize that in you? Through me. I'm the filter, and I am that which is filtered. So it's a mistake. I mean, it's got psychology at that end of the pool, in my humble opinion, has physics envy and medical envy as well. It's aspirations. They go too far and they're not humble. And then they start making claims about human behavior and human personalities as though they were describing the skeletal system or the internal organs. You can't do that.
So there's no certainty, is there really? It's very subjective.
Very.
There's no place to find depression in the brain.
No.
Yeah, so a lot of it comes down to the subjective interpretation of the therapist.
Just to cut off your trolls here, there's no place in the brain that we can say this is depression. They will say, well, we can do brain scans, and the brain scans of depressed people look like this. But that, again, as I said before about that's a logical fallacy. That's cum hoc ergo propter hoc. It's not causation. Just because it's come up at the same time, the correlation is there, but it's not causation. Just because, I don't know, everybody who has an orgasm has the brainwave in a particular state doesn't mean there was something in their brain that caused them to experience orgasm. The brain is, as the rest of the body is, reflecting the experience, and the experience is brought about by, my God, these become philosophical questions. Why do we do what we do? Do we have free will? What are your beliefs? And so on.
But the thing about the brain is interesting because we may see it represented on a computer screen that's where this experience was generated. Is that I've seen studies which show that people can have full functioning consciousness and motor ability when most of the brain is gone.
Yes.
And it's the brain skull. The skull is just filled with fluid, and there's a tiny little bit of brain on the outskirts of the skull. But yet there is no problem with their motor functions, their speech, their thought, their consciousness.
Fascinating, isn't it?
What the hell's going on there?
Totally fascinating. So the idea that your brain can be cut up into quadrants and different geographical locations, and we carve out this territory, and that what they're doing is they're mapping the brain to the body. Like if I cut your arm off, you definitely don't have an arm. If I cut off part of your brain, how could you still walk? If that's the singing part of the brain, how do you still sing? And this is the fascinating thing about human beings. We're not incredibly powerful compared to other animals. Our superpower is adaptability, and that's reflected in the brain. It's neuroplasticity, a term I know that you know. And the brain will just adapt. It will go, okay, well, what do I need to do to keep surviving? Not always, but in the cases that you mentioned, children born, there's a genetic disorder, they have half a brain, and nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
It's not like they were blind in one eye and one side of their body didn't work, which if it was rigid, and we were this rigid animal machine, predictable in that way, that's what you would predict to happen.
Well, it kind of puts scoff to a lot of, the mainstream medical science that tells us, we are a biological machine and nothing else.
Yeah.
We live, we die, and that's the end of it.
Yeah.
I was speaking to Matthias Desmet recently, done a podcast with him, and he's written a book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism, in which he puts forward his thesis on understanding the psychology behind mass formation. What his main example is what we've just experienced over the last 2 years. But interestingly, it's a 3-part book. It's only short. Part 1, he talks about the history of science and how we've ended up where we are. And that science originally started as a discovery for truth. It was a minority against the majority, and it was people testing the system and about being open-minded to trying and testing everything. But at some point, the Enlightenment kind of kicked it off, didn't it? The scientific revolution. And this journey to reason, man was breaking away from superstition and dogma of religion and the church. And the Enlightenment led us on this path, but it's now created the opposite of what the intention of the Enlightenment was, which was to free man, free us from dogmatic beliefs. But now we're in something called Scientism, which mainstream science seems to be as dogmatic and as belief-based as the religion we supposedly left behind.
Exactly.
But scientism lacks the most important element of religion, which was God, doesn't it? And it created this mechanistic worldview in which, from the Enlightenment, it was like, all we are is a bundle of particles joined together by some accidents of history. And, as a result, that's allowed us to enter into this new phase of our development in which mass formation is possible, and so is totalitarianism. Part of what he talks about in this analysis, he describes narcissism as part of the child's developmental phase. Goes through a certain phase where we're narcissistic to the other and the mother and stuff. We want the object of her love and attention over everything else. And I thought of you.
People think narcissism, they think
that's okay, isn't it? But anyway, so I thought, that's one of the key areas of your work, and for which you're famous now. What do you think about how narcissism relates to what I've just described with the mechanistic ideology, and is the reason that we are so lost currently as a society because we haven't resolved these narcissistic tendencies that we have as children, and they just carry on into adulthood?
I think in the 3 minutes that you were speaking there's probably a book worth of content that you could go through. I mean, literally, there's probably a solid 50,000 words there just to explore the different areas. Narcissism plays into this as it pertains to scientism in multiple ways. And I'm sorry, what's the guy's name?
Matthias Desmet.
Desmet. Okay. Matthias I knew, but Desmet I didn't.
Flemish.
Okay. That's hence the name.
Yeah.
The difficult name.
From Ghent, he's a professor in Ghent University.
Right. Yeah. It was a great university.
Right.
And this guy, fascinating. I've listened to him speak a number of times, and I love the mass formation model that he puts forward. Rather than saying mass psychosis, he says mass formation.
That's right.
I really like that.
Well, he said that the psychosis only came from Robert Malone when he did Joe Rogan, and then all of a sudden this term mass formation psychosis stuck, and he said, no, I've only ever said mass formation because the psychosis makes it sound like you're saying they're mad. And if you do say they're mad, you lose them in any kind of dialogue that you want to have with them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think he's right. I mean, people can make a strong case that it is a form of psychosis because it's delusional. But yes, we shouldn't call it psychosis if we want to, in good faith, maintain the dialogue. To the scientism point, yes, this has become the new orthodoxy. Yes, this is the new dogma. And we should have seen that coming if it wasn't for our lack of humility. So I want to make a sort of a Zizek-style point without sneezing and coughing and tugging at my shirt and everything. There's narcissism, and that's a factor. And then there's a critical lack of humility. They are kind of the same thing. The reason why it's a Zizek-style point is because he's a Lacanian. a good Lacanian, and he always likes to do the inversion of any subject. So he inverts everything. When we talk about narcissism, it builds a certain narrative. You think of people who are grandiose, thrusting, bullying, vain, manipulative, and everything else, which is correct, they are. But when you describe people who, in all naivety and innocence, simply lack humility, they just don't have humility, I think that probably gets us a little bit more nuance closer to the truth. Scientism, riddled with narcissism, classic narcissism, we just described it. But I think the worst thing, the more dangerous thing, was the shadow aspect of narcissism, which is just a lack of humility. There was no restraints put in. There was no sense of, we're going to places we've never been to before. Let's make our assertions carefully and quietly and be, which they were originally, as you rightly said, historically, because, well, science was the antithesis to a thesis, which was religion. So they were the rebels. They were the free-thinking rebels. They're not the free-thinking rebels now. No. They're the conformists, and they're not free-thinking. They're rigid. These are generalizations. Many scientists are not, obviously. So where was the narcissism or critical lack of humility at the center of scientism? So you said, and you're right, the mechanistic, what we call the modern Western mechanistic view of reality, post-Enlightenment, has no God. Scientismists, if I could say that, the high priests of scientism will say, we don't need God, because in his place at the top of the pyramid, the Illuminati, the Eye of Sauron, we have, or Horus, we have...
Sauron's a better description.
It's probably a better description, because Horus could be good or bad. Yeah. There is something there. It's reason. Okay, my friend. Whose reason? Your reason. Human reason. It's not infallible, as we just said. Like, there's this whole issue in philosophy, the intrasubjectivity thing, where you say, I had a cheese sandwich this morning, and through language, I create that hallucination in my mind and imagine myself doing the same thing, and then I know your experience. But that's false. I don't really know what that truly meant to you. I have an approximation through simulation of what it meant to you. We are fallible. So there's no God anymore. We don't need God. We have pure reason. Please, like, what human being has pure reason? You're fantasizing. There are, you need to go back into religion to sort of explore how people take the Vedic tradition for thousands of years that we're aware of, at least 7,000 years, human beings attempting to purify their perception, rid it of ego, of lust, of greed, of desire, of everything, to see reality just as it is. Decades of fasting, no sex, no alcohol, are really fucking miserable. And then, some people say, they got some degree of enlightenment at the end of that. We're dirty in the sense of the filter, the lens that we're using to see reality is not clean. It has stuff on it. We can engage in practices, dieting, fasting, whatever, that help. But I don't believe there's pure reason. I think that's a fallacy. That's a fallacious notion. It shows a critical lack of humility, and it is narcissism. I am purely reasonable. We, the high priests of scientism, are purely reasonable. No desire for money, no desire for fame, no desire to shag our young, beautiful student assistants. Fuck out of here. It's nonsense. Stop it. Just stop. We have to stop the pretense. And I feel this is a theme for me that I'm quite passionate about at the moment. We have to stop posing. We have to stop pretending. There isn't the time. We don't have the luxury of this kind of pretense anymore. You, I, all of us who, what are we, in the alternative media, or we have a different way of thinking about things. Yeah. We must reduce our tolerance for this nonsense. It's nonsense. Stop being so charitable. Stop being so tolerant. Stop letting your opponents browbeat you by telling you they're more rational than you are. They are not. Look at what we just lived through. Yeah. All that pandemic profiteering. From top to bottom, psychologists, doctors, professors, virologists, epidemiologists, politicians, police, hospital administrators, all of them with dirty hands now. Go fuck yourself.
But it seems to be a weakness of humanity that we can fall for such bullshit so easily and go along with it. And like you said, it was all institutions, some of the most intelligent people in society, we're all caught up in the mass formation or the mass hypnosis, and they believe it. Right? I don't even think that they're, knowingly are being fraudulent. I think they're caught up in the whole drama and narrative and the bullshit that's being spun from the mass formation, and both sides are feeding each other. I don't think they actually do believe in it. It's a bit of a problem because, if society can be led so easily along the path to which we see not only the massive restrictions we saw upon society, but, if that would have been allowed to go any further, the masses were clamoring to lock us up in concentration camps or quarantine camps. They were gagging for it, right?
And those actually really occurred in the real world in Australia.
Yeah, totally.
They were not a fantasy, they were a reality.
They were reality, yeah. And then, in Canada, people are not allowed to leave or do anything without being force vaccinated. So if that orgy of weird cultish behavior was allowed to continue to its fruition, we would have maybe saw an escalation in atrocities that have happened previously when masses have been caught up, like the French Revolution, for instance. It just turned into an orgy of violence, didn't it?
I never studied the French Revolution, but during the lockdown, I found myself drawn to that subject.
Yeah.
I was drawn to studying the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and the French Revolution and what led to it. And how did people get to the point where they felt that was the right conclusion?
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a bad night. Like people got really angry, a bit drunk on a Saturday night and they did a terrible thing. No, this was organized and it went on and on and on. People...
And it's supported by the masses.
Oh, supported by everybody.
Yeah.
This is the will of the people that's being represented, make no mistake.
Yeah.
This isn't... we always end up using Nazi Germany as an example, but it's such an extreme example, it's useful. We can say that didn't necessarily represent the will of the masses.
Yeah.
There were plenty of people who did not want that. There were plenty of people who did not fully know exactly what was going on. But in the case of the Khmer Rouge, that was the will of the people. Otherwise, it could not. It just physically couldn't have taken place. And the French Revolution, the same. I wanted to ask you a couple of things. One of them was, you said that largely speaking, you believe that the people who are involved in the mass formation really believed in what was going on, and they were naively believing in it. What does it mean? When you say they believed in it, what do you mean?
Okay, so Gustave Le Bon, who's done probably the most seminal work on mass formation and group psychology, and he says when people are in a crowd, they change. They become one, and they're willing to sacrifice their ethics, and they go along with the whole narrative. So when I say they believe it, is that there seems to be a common consensus that there are 4 criteria required for a mass formation to happen. The first is social isolation. The more socially isolated the population are, the more susceptible they are to the mass formation that follows. And what we've seen over the mechanistic ideology of the last 250 years, as we've gone away from the land in the Industrial Revolution, and we've become more and more atomized, more and more separated from nature and from our fellow man, is that first case, that first most important factor, which is social isolation, is in place and was in place before the lockdown. And the second one is a lack of meaning. Right? As we've moved through the Enlightenment, we've moved further and further away from God, or from a supreme being, or from this idea that our souls live on after this existence. And then we have all these bullshit jobs that people do. So they've gone from working on the land, which had meaning, to pulling a lever or pressing a button, which has no meaning for them at all. So you have social isolation, followed by lack of meaning, which then creates free-floating anxiety. People are anxious and they don't know why. And then free-floating aggression, which follows that. They're angry and they don't know why. So when we have that perfect storm, that soup, and then the state, or whoever it is, introduces a narrative that allows people who are socially isolated to come together and fight under a common banner, right? So they all of a sudden, they've got a meaning, they've got something to fight for, and they've got meaning in their lives. And then an object of anxiety is presented. So no longer is it free floating. They can say, there you go, that coronavirus, that's the object of your anxiety. And then another party is put forward, like the the anti-vaxxers or whatever you want to
The
call them,
unvaccinated.
or the unvaccinated, they become the object of aggression. So all of a sudden you have all the criteria that was in place and the narrative is thrown into society and people just go along with it and they believe it because there is a psychological benefit to going along with the mass formation, right? They actually get, they feel better.
Yeah.
Because the anxiety is gone. So it doesn't matter whether you're an extremely intelligent, highly educated person. If you're suffering from no psychological issue and the mass formation solves them, you're just going to go along with it. So that's the theory of how it works.
Everything you just said actually reminds me of Karl Marx. And I was just listening to Lex Friedman and Douglas Murray on the way over. And Douglas Murray was saying to Lex Friedman, I can't think of anything that Karl Marx said that was of any use. I think that's a bit uncharitable. I'll take it up with Douglas Murray when I eventually interview him for a podcast. One of Marx's, I think, valid criticisms of and compassionate criticisms of capitalism was that would lead to this. The first two states you mentioned, one was alienation from each other, and then I think the second one was alienation from your labor, from your work. It's called in Marxist philosophy, it's called alienation.
So it's the same 2 points there then, isn't it?
It's the same. Yeah. And he was saying, he wasn't even saying, well, Marx is a historian, economist, kind of a philosopher, kind of a psychologist. He was saying it is like this now, but it will get worse. And he's right, the Communist Manifesto is 1850. So it will get worse. You will feel worse. Marxist philosophers since then have made the point again and again. Obviously, Zizek is one such. I was just talking to Sam Vaknin the other day, and he used the phrase, the manipulation of symbols in a fantastic space. That is more and more our life, our work life, our interpersonal life, the way we use social media, is the manipulation of symbols, avatars, signifiers in a fantastical space. These are Marxist criticisms of capitalism. The point I am meandering to is twofold. One is probably that this is an inevitable consequence, not just of the Enlightenment, but also of consumer capitalism. I'm saying consumer capitalism because, unlike Marx, I don't hate capitalism. I want to rehabilitate it, not destroy it. Consumer capitalism is poison. I believe that. It is evil. It's intrinsically evil, and I think I can make a strong case for saying why it's intrinsically evil. You mentioned nudging. Consumer capitalism requires that we use psychology to exploit human weaknesses to make them do what we want them to do, as a politician would. The second point is this thing of coming together and forming a group identity based on a grievance and then having an identified target. There's an element of the Nietzschean concept, ressentiment, which we've discussed before. You must find a target for that. The National Socialists found a target for that. The French Revolutionists found a target. The Khmer Rouge did.
The bourgeoisie, the Bolsheviks.
The Bolshevik Revolution. It's all their fault. Let's go kill the kulaks because they have farms and more money than we do. And it's always, it's up. Somebody above us, more power, control over the banking system, control over the farm, whatever. The Khmer Rouge, I think you just had to live in a city.
Or wear glasses.
Yeah. That meant you were an intellectual and intellectuals were bad. And it just insanity, total insanity. So Karl Marx identified it, but then Karl Marxists have lived it. They've put it into practice, ironically. But I'm not seeking to rehabilitate Marx, because if you read things like the Communist Manifesto, I would say violence is the inevitable result of that book.
Well, the thing is,
it's a grenade.
People say that Marx's analysis of capitalism is correct and accurate, but it's his prescription in how to deal with it. That's the problem.
100% agree.
Which is a total violent revolution. Which
his prescriptions are somewhere between barbaric and childish. I mean, they're just moronic. The ideas that his resolutions, people get very confused about communism. And I was confused for years because it's not easy to penetrate.
No.
Nobody has achieved communism who has police. If you have police, that's not communism. If you have money, that's not communism. And if you have a state, that's not Marxist communism. So when we talk about...
But do you reckon the closest to a true Marxist state has been Pol Pot? Pol Pot was trained in France, educated in Paris, was a full-on Marxist, and if there's any, all analysis says that the closest that they've ever come to a perfect Marxist state was Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're killing people still, you've not achieved. I'm not defending communism. This is the kind of thing a fucking communist would say. Communism's never been done. It's always statism. It's always socialism, which is on the way to communism. But I think it's worth acknowledging so that we understand just how. My point is how stupid that is. Yeah. No money, no police, no state. Just the people living hand in hand, jerking each other off all day and feeding each other. What the? That's not human nature, man. It's an inhuman. It's a woefully
trying to force a human ideology upon human nature, isn't it? That
it's ridiculous, and that on its own won't cause bloodshed. What causes bloodshed is when we say, "Well, I don't have anything; you have something. I'm taking it off you." Okay, now violence is inevitable. Plus, he literally calls for violence multiple times in the Communist Manifesto.
He was asked to define communism, and he does so in the Communist Manifesto, in which he says communism is defined as the abolition of private property. And so that is communism's definition by Marx himself. So, first of all, what is private property?
Yeah, because he contradicts himself.
The first bit of private property is your body, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's my property, and it's private to me. And then there's an extension of what that private property is, and to the abolition of all private property.
But in the same book, he writes, because it's him and Engels, isn't it?
Yeah.
He says, what do we mean when we say the abolition of private property? You will say that we want to take the table and chairs out of your house. We're not interested in your private property. And I'm like, Karl.
All seems pretty prescriptive.
Yeah, Karl, can you be a bit more careful with your flipping words? People are taking you seriously here, mate. Also, just for historical accuracy, people need to remember he didn't invent socialism or communism.
No.
It existed before him.
Yeah.
It was more of a battle rap thing where he was like, he's wrong, he's shit, they're shit, they're shit. This is the real one. This is how we're going to do it. And it is self-contradictory. It is messy. The private property thing still befuddles me because, yes, it will be when we've destroyed all private property. Footnote, private property here means, and then we get this waffly, hard to penetrate word salad where you are actually allowed to keep your stuff. And I'm like, well, people don't get that, Karl. Yeah. You need to explain that again.
Because another one of his quotes is that democracy leads to socialism and socialism leads to communism.
Yes.
Right? So we're now under the, influence of Uncle Schwab's constant, messages into society. Famous one now, which is probably, going to be the quote of this era, which is, you will own nothing and be happy, which sounds awfully similar to the abolition of all private property.
Yeah.
And it seems as if Schwab, his gang, WEF and all of the cronies that are connected to this, technocratic revolution that they're talking about, seems to me that it's kind of like the transition from democracy to socialism or to global socialism as defined by them, I guess, but also, as part of Marx's prophecy.
Interesting. I think one of the reasons why this is such an anxiety-inducing time for human beings to live in is the degree of complexity that we're living in. As human beings, we look to the past to make sense of our present and to predict the future. And we can't really here because this is a weird hybrid of neo-feudalism and communism. And for people to understand what people like Schwab are saying is it's communism for you scumbags.
Yeah.
And for us, it's feudalism.
Yeah.
We will keep everything and be happy, and you lot will eat bugs.
Well, there is an actual
rent your furniture.
Marx did define. He said there was different types of socialism and communism, and there was one called feudal socialism.
Was it really?
Yeah, there's an actual category of socialism called feudal socialism.
I've never heard of defining different types of socialism, but for people, like the complexity of Marx, there's at least 9 different types of communism that he defined as well. And you think, fucking hell. The only one that I agreed with from Marx is he had a type of communism called primitive communism, which is what we spontaneously had as hunter-gatherers. When you live in a tribe of 19 people and you're scavenging and hunting every day, you share everything.
Yeah, of course.
Of course. You don't need police there. Of course you don't need a state there. But once you move beyond 19 to 19 million, it can't work that way. It just...
Well, I'd say I'm more of an anarchist than anything else, in the terms of I don't believe in anyone has the authority, unless I grant him it, to force me to do anything. I think it's a crime, isn't it, to force me to do something against my will. Yeah. So therefore, that kind of is classical, traditional anarchy. Yeah, not the anarchy that we think of with Antifa, defacing and causing vandalism. I think it's true anarchy is that we live as we want to by our own will, instead of someone else trying to impose their will upon us. However, that works in a peaceful situation, doesn't it? But if your neighbor or your invader or your conqueror doesn't see life the same way, then it's difficult to maintain an anarchist outlook. So how do you square that circle, in terms of you need protection or we need to come together to protect each other? Is that where a monarch comes in? I don't know. Because I don't think democracy is...
That's where I come in.
That's where you come in,
benevolent
King
dictator.
Richard.
Yeah, King Richard.
Richard's back. Mad King Richard.
Mad King Richard, yeah. Life would be good. It would be harsh, but it would be good.
But it's like, it's difficult, isn't it? Because being from Liverpool, being from this part of the world, is that this is very much a socialist city. And I can understand why, because it's working class people fighting against the elite who seek to oppress us. And I can understand why socialism can be seen as the vehicle for which to take us out of that plight. I don't think it is, but ultimately I can see why that is. Now, have you been watching the news recently with a guy called, I think it's Michael Lynch?
No, I haven't seen this.
Okay, so he's the head of the RMT, which is the Rail Workers Union, or RMU, Rail Workers Union. And he's the head of that union. And he has been all over the news recently, eviscerating all of the phony journalists and newscasters and politicians. And it doesn't matter what channel he's being invited on. He's literally just all guns blazing, exposing them for the absolute shills that they are. Yeah. And he was having a debate with the Tory MP on Newsnight, and he was just saying, you're a liar. Right. You're lying to the public, and you're lying. Stop lying. And the guy didn't know how to deal with it, right? Because he thought, you're meant to be on my side. We're not meant to do this. This is meant to be theatre, know. But the guy wasn't having it, and he's absolutely brilliant. He really is brilliant, and he is causing such a noise at the moment. Is that we're just given this false reality, aren't we, through the news and the media and through politicians, and our impression is that they're fighting our corner. But this guy's like Scargill was. He was just giving it to them, and his argument is that people are saying, okay, well, the rail workers are already well paid. Why are they asking for more money, right? And as someone who has just suffered quite an inconvenience from the rail strike, I can kind of understand where people's reluctance to support their struggle comes from. They're not nurses, are they? No. Right. So they've got a difficult battle in the public sphere. And Lynch makes the argument. He says that due to the government's involvement in giving contracts to private companies to run the railways on public tracks that we still pay for with our taxes. Yeah. So it's only the rolling stock on the top, right? Right. And the government's new contract allows these companies to rake in billions through price increase. Yeah. And he goes, why shouldn't we, the workers, the ones who are actually doing the labour, see a share of that? Right. Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough. And at least they've got someone fighting their corner for that to be the case.
Yeah, why should we all just accept the status quo that there's a different class of human being? They always got all the wealth, and we always did the work, and they always will, and we should just keep going. No, I agree with that.
Yeah, but it's what's the problem they've got is the envy from the common man. Think, well, actually, why is he's only driving a train? Why should he be asking for more money? Yeah. So they've got a bit of a problem. I don't know how he's going to win that public battle, because the government will know that the public won't be supporting it for long.
Well, okay, so I don't have an answer, but I have a way of thinking about this, and I'll take my life in my hands here, because I still live in Liverpool, go to the gym here, and I go out here. Scousers are full of shit. Yeah. Fucking hell, here we go. Yeah. When we say Scousers are socialists, which is absolutely true, it's a
as a fashion, isn't it?
As a trend, it's bollocks.
Yeah.
Humans are opportunistic. So I've seen, and you've seen, Scousers, super socialist when they got nothing, And then when they make something, they fuck off to Caldy and buy a big house. They don't stay in Toxteth. They don't stay on Scotty Road. They go and buy a house in Chester. I've seen mates of mine do this all day, Scouser to death, lad, you know, fucking love town and that. Where are you? I'm in Chester, darling. Where have you gone? Well, I made some money. I'm not a socialist anymore.
Yeah.
When you don't have it, and I don't begrudge anybody that, but I think we have to be humble and start talking in more honest terms about our politics.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult subject to raise. And I think it fits in with what we were saying earlier about the psychology and the philosophy. When you don't have anything and you're broke, let's say you're a student and you're 21 and your parents are poor, you've got into university through your own intellect. It's unlikely you're going to show up and say, no, I'm a right-wing conservative and I'm for maintaining the hierarchy and elitism. And yes, the vast resources should go upward, not downward. It's unlikely. If you're a single mum, same thing. And you've got no money and you're living on an estate somewhere, you'll probably be left-leaning because you can't get capital for yourself. So you would prefer someone to simply redistribute the wealth and give it to you. On the flip side of the coin, private school boy, inherited wealth through generations, let's say 3 generations, due to inherit millions, unlikely you would be a socialist unless it's trendy and you're posing in front of, perhaps you have some lower class friends that you hang around with and you pretend that you wish things were fairer. Meanwhile, you're taking 3 skiing holidays a year and going on daddy's yacht. People are full of shit.
Yeah.
I don't really believe people's politics. Liverpool is a socialist city, yes, and except in the times when this was built and it was going to be the alternative to London, it wasn't.
Well, Liverpool was a Tory stronghold.
Tory stronghold.
Until the 1970s.
So this idea we have, you know, I think it's we've eulogized ourselves the cheeky rebel Irish descendant, fiddly diddly dee, you know, we'll fight you in the streets and you know, yeah, okay, fine, but not when we were wealthy as fuck, not when we were the richest port on the planet. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but by today's measure, the port was pulling in billions, and that's why we have such a strange and unique architecture here, because it was new money. People who were nobodies, or fishermen, maybe they were sea captains and they were doing okay, suddenly had a huge amount of money that they could bring in, and they flashed it around and they spent it on big buildings and on this and that. So I think to really seriously break rapport, I think Scousers, people in the Northwest, we need to stop with this because it's not true. And you've got to do the thought experiment with yourself. Would you be saying what you're saying about being a socialist if you were a millionaire? So if you win the lottery tomorrow, man of the people, I'm going to give it to all my family and friends and just read it. Some people are like that, you know, maybe. I'd like to interview Paddy Pimblett.
Yeah.
He has his own podcast and he says he's that way. And I'm sure there are exceptions, people like him who I know are pretty good with it. Who's the footballer who was big when I was on the door in Liverpool? Oh, God, from Liverpool.
John Barnes?
It was John Barnes. He'd already retired. He was Wayne Rooney.
Okay, yeah. And
his family, I won't say how I knew, but they were working class people, and I would be in regular contact with them through door security work because of the jobs they had. But once he came up and he made money, I never saw them again. They weren't doing that blue collar work anymore. They disappeared because there was a redistribution of wealth, which is what Laurence talks about. Laurence Kenwright. You should be an entrepreneur, and you should also be a socialist entrepreneur, and the money should seamlessly be redistributed. Okay, fine. Some people do it. But as a generalization, people's politics tend to be self-serving. Like, I
think we just need new ideas. I think, you know, socialism and capitalism, you know, we're talking like 150-year-old ideas, aren't they? I think the, you know, even older, but I think the world has changed.
It's such a good point because when we're talking, so I would say if you go back to 1906 and you talk about Rosa Luxemburg and her points about capitalism, and she said it's socialism or barbarism, I'd be like, she's right. She's right. You have some twat nowadays, like Antifa style bellend, telling me that this country is racist and awful and should be overthrown. Historically illiterate, geographically moronic plonkers who are just reaction seekers. No, that kind of socialism, they should be thrown in the Mersey. But so there's different socialisms, there's different capitalism. Capitalism in her day, in 1905, 1910, was war. It was war, it was brutality, it was barbarism. It isn't today. I'm a capitalist. I work online. I'm an entrepreneur. There's no war. I don't kill anybody to make money. But I can afford, the technology now affords me to make decent money in a way that actually is karmically viable. It helps people. So which capitalism, where capitalism, which socialism, where socialism? It's a good point you make.
Well, it's I did another interview in Netherlands on my little trip. I've just been away to Europe. Went to do Matthias Desmet in Ghent in Belgium, and then I went to do another podcast with an old friend of mine who is from Holland, half Irish, Anthony Meikels. He's a specialist in interest-free currencies. Really good conversation, and it's the first time I've met him. You know, when you've got friends online and you've been friends for a long time,
right?
You know, but you've never actually met in real life.
Yeah.
It was great. It was interesting. I felt like I already knew him, you know, but it was great to meet him. And he didn't disappoint. But he is very clued up on what he believes is the solution to our issue is that it's neither socialism nor capitalism, and the problem is that society generally thinks that, well, if you're not a socialist, then you must be a capitalist. And if you're not a capitalist, you must be a socialist. Yeah. And he says that the way through this noise, the way through this impasse that we have economically and socially and politically is that we need interest-free currency, right? And that he's created a currency in Holland, or the Netherlands, they call it now, don't they? In the Netherlands, called the Florijn, and it's an interest-free currency, right? So it's a medium of exchange. It's not a store of value. It's not something you use to save. It's literally something that you use to exchange as money, and it runs alongside the euro. Yeah, and it's been taken up by about 2,500 businesses and people within Holland, and he's doing quite well, but he's been at it for a while. And he says is that capitalism, modern capitalism, crony capitalism that we see today is just a result of interest or usury, like we discussed in the podcast. And while that's in place, is that we will always be chasing a debt or a scarcity of resources because of this artificial scarcity created by the usury system at the top, which is through capitalism, which brings out the worst in humanity. When there is a scarcity of resources, in this case, money, right? It's not because there isn't enough money, because it isn't an abundance of money. It's that it's artificially made scarce in the same way diamonds are. They sit on a mountain of diamonds, but they just release them little by little to keep the value high. They do the same with money through the usury system. And he says that a lot of the problems that we see, the conflicts that we see, and the worst parts of human nature come out of this competitiveness that is created through scarcity.
Yes, which is that's the key argument I have for trying to steelman my position that consumer capitalism is fundamentally evil. You must generate evil in people to get them to buy shit that they don't need. It's lust, greed, and envy. I can't really think of maybe some of the other sins might be involved in it, but it's our classic definitions of evil: lust, greed, envy.
Well, the 7 deadly sins, the vices that we fight against, our passions.
Oh, gluttony would be one.
Yeah, pride.
Oh yeah, actually no, all the 7 deadly sins.
All of the 7 deadly sins.
You are required to feed Babylon.
And I believe that those behavioral elements that cause us to seek those sins come from a scarcity of resources.
Yes, absolutely.
Because when it's scarce, we'll fight for what's available, or we'll do whatever is necessary in order to make sure that we get the resources. And if there is a general consensus in society that resources are scarce, the people who've got them hoard them.
Yes.
Because they don't know when it's going to run out, or it could run out completely next week, the week after, the month after. So, you know what? I'm going to sit on this. And I'm going to sit on this mound that gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And while one person's sitting on a huge mound of money, all the other people who are fighting over an even more scarce set of resources become even crazier by their behavior.
And when Marx was talking about a capitalist, that's who he was talking about.
But what Marx doesn't do is that he spent most of his life in the British Library studying economics and everything else, and he creates this magnum opus on economics and capitalism, but doesn't mention usury. doesn't mention interest on money, which is the driver of capitalism or crony capitalism.
Does he not mention it at all?
He doesn't mention it, right? So
he talks about parasites, capitalists as parasites who feed off the excess of production.
Yeah.
But never mentions interest rates.
No, so interest as a mechanism of capitalism doesn't bring it up. Now, I asked Anthony about that. I said, well, why would this guy who spent most of his adult life studying this subject not do that? He said, well, do you know who was funding him? I said, no. So how do you think he managed to maintain a lifestyle of just being a student his entire life?
Isn't it Engels' dad that funded him?
Rothschild apparently was one of his funders, one of the Rothschild family. So he says that's one of the reasons why usury isn't mentioned in Das Kapital. So that's something for us to.
That's interesting.
That's something for us to have a little deeper into.
That's interesting.
Because what that's saying is what he's saying there is that it's a controlled opposition. It's given us the dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic, the false Hegelian dialectic, which is you're either a capitalist or you're a socialist, and it's one or the other. As long as you're not talking about the real issue, which is interest on money and what the bankers do behind the scenes.
Hey, that might actually be true.
Yeah.
And if that is,
hey, we could have some answers here.
Hey, hang on a second, lads. I need to think about that.
Yeah.
What? Well, yeah, because there's no reason. If you're talking about capitalist parasites and they feed off the excess of production, but you don't mention usury, you don't mention interest, something is missing there. So
it's an incomplete work, either by design or by incompetence. Yeah, so but it's incomplete,
because it doesn't point people at the right enemy; it points them at the wrong enemy.
Or he could make the argument that interest isn't the enemy, but the fact that he just omits it completely from the conversation.
That's very strange.
Yeah,
that's very, very strange.
Yeah. Now, there might be some Marxist scholars, academics, or historians watching this podcast who may think differently, and I look forward to being
I would love to be educated on that.
Yeah.
Because, well, in this model, in this hypothesis that you've proposed, it's a so Marx and Marxism, as a way of summing up all the different socialisms and communism and putting it in one place, which makes it neater, is controlled opposition. But it's a capitalist-created controlled opposition. Yeah,
because Trotsky and Lenin, when they went to Russia to foment the revolution, they were carrying $20 million, which is about $1 billion today, and that $20 million was donated to them by Warburg, the New York banker, in order to form. I mean, this is in Trotsky's biography.
Why would he do that?
Because they were fomenting revolution in Russia because the Tsar and his father had refused a central bank in Russia. Right? And one of the first things that Lenin instituted once he became, the new Tsar was a central bank in Russia. And he said, central to communism is central banking. That's Lenin's own words. So there's something for us to.
That's very interesting.
Go deeper on.
No, it's very, very interesting, and people might say it's outlandish, but it would answer a lot of unanswered questions. Because for years I've been thinking, why did?
But they were in New York. I mean, that's not up for debate. Is that Trotsky and Lenin were holed up in New York, doing what we don't know, right? And then they left. Went to Sweden first, I think, on a train, and then from Sweden into
this all seems fine.
Yeah, on a train. It was a hidden train. They were taken in with a big load of cash, massive load of cash. Got into St. Petersburg and then started fomenting the revolution. Started paying the revolutionaries that needed paying, and then before you know it, you had
the dominoes toppled on their own.
You had the overthrow of the Tsar and the monarchy in Russia, and then the next thing you know, we're at the Bolshevik Revolution, millions died.
Yeah.
Stalinism, millions died.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting because one of the things that's always concerned me with Marx, which I don't claim to understand Marx, but I've given the Communist Manifesto a good go over the last 6 years, is why so many people invest in it when it reads like fiction. When I say it reads like fiction, the only way Marx's vision of communism could function is in a science fiction future. And I sort of think, how does anybody really believe that this is useful. And maybe they were so smart back then that they knew that this would appeal to raw human instincts, and they sort of induced their own mass formation.
Well, it would be like, total psychology, wouldn't it? It's to understand human behavior on such a level that your prescriptions will come to pass 100 years into the future.
It's incredible.
Yeah. I'm not sure that that's smart, though. Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, because certainly results were created, and I won't bang on about it too much. People should pick up the Communist Manifesto. It is a very strange piece of work. It's violent. It doesn't really feel so much like a book as like a literary grenade that's being tossed. And I understand people's fascination with it. I find it fascinating. I just don't buy into it. I'm just like, this is interesting. Oh, that's an interesting criticism. Nonsense. But other people have gone, here's my Bible.
Yeah.
Let's make this happen. Like, what world do you think you will have left after your revolution?
Well, the Chinese, I mean, the Chinese, and people say, it's not real communism, but, Xi Jinping comes out regularly and says that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Revolution are built upon the ideas of Marx and Lenin. He still says it repeatedly today. So
yes, the ideas of
the influence is incredible. The influence of Marx on the world is truly incredible. What he's been able to, the way his vision is being carried on by so many totalitarian leaders, and the death and destruction that's gone in the wake of his economic ideas, because that's all they are the economic ideas.
Pretty much.
Yeah, it's quite an incredible narrative in human history.
Let me give you an experiment. This is just a thought experiment. I don't really believe this. People are very, very stupid and naive on the whole. You only have to motivate. The majority of people are the workers in any country. You only have to motivate them with a childish utopian fantasy of riches and wonder over that next hill. In order to get from point A to point B, if you tell them, look, you may have to wade through a few rivers of blood. Don't worry, history will absolve you. Keep killing. The utopia at your beautiful 5-star apartment, it's just over there. Maybe it's as dumb as that.
Well,
we shouldn't read into it too much.
The doctrine of envy, isn't it, in a large degree? It's like, they've got more than you, so go kill them.
Yeah.
But in mass formation, it's argued that there is a segmentation of society, that 30% of the population, the main mass of the population, are the ones who go for the narrative hook, line, and sinker. They are totally consumed by the narrative. That becomes their reality.
Which percentage of the population?
30%. And it can be all strata. It's not working class or upper class. It's everybody within the population. There's a 30% split that are totally, utterly committed to the cult. And then there's 40% in the middle who don't believe the mass formation, but they're scared of the government and they're scared of stepping out of line, so they just walk with their heads down. And then the final 30% never fall for it. The mass formation will never work on them for whatever reason. And they're the vocal opposition to the mass formation in society.
That sort of answers the question which I was gonna press you on before, is when you said they believe in this. So there's 70%.
There are 30 who believe it.
There's 30 who do, and 40
who are scared,
and they'll just go along. So some of these, when we mentioned like police, hospital administrators, professors, and so on, some of them would be in that 40%.
100%.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, totally. And the struggle, right? So the government,
so they believe, but not really.
Well, they don't fall for the absurdity of the rituals that are performed in the mass formation.
Oh, they wouldn't be clapping on a Thursday night for the NHS.
No, but they may do if they thought they would be watched. They're being watched, or they're being threatening their position in the collective. Yeah. Right. It's like it's the ostracization from the collective, that if you don't comply with the absurd rituals that are being proposed by the mass formation, and there's a good 40%. Now the struggle, the totalitarian regime, the bureaucratic, technocratic regime that are bringing these narratives into society in order to get the 30% whipped up and really going, right, is that The struggle is between the 30% who are totally consumed by the mass formation and the 30% who aren't, because those in the middle, the 40%, that's who the battle's over. So the ones who don't believe it are trying to convince the ones in the middle, this is bullshit, this is bullshit.
Yeah.
And the 30% at the other end are saying, don't listen to them because they're just traitors. They're traitors to the collective. They're trying to end this, this collective effort by the people in order to beat the virus or beat the whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So that's how it kind of it's split up.
How do you think that maps onto Nazi Germany?
Well, it's probably, Desmet argues that the two most recent historical examples of how modern mass formation works, because the more mass media has become a part of our lives, is that as we become socially atomized and we've got the mass media constantly into our brain, it's much easier for them to do. And he argues that Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia were the two most recent examples of the transition from a traditional dictatorship, which was ruled by fear. But generally, once the dictator was in, he then, for his own common sense, he'd be nice then because, we'd got power and he didn't want to turn the people against them. So that was a classical dictatorship. And then we have the modern totalitarian state, which is built upon mass formation. He said that the Nazi regime and the Soviet regime was the transition between those two eras. And now the totalitarian state that we have is not these bully boys like Hitler and Stalin appeared to be with the, with the military uniforms. Now we have faceless, soulless, technocratic bureaucrats wear suits and they just blend into the background. Look at Macron, look at Boris, look at Trudeau, look at the weirdo in New Zealand. These are all carbon cutouts of the same, bureaucratic leader that they want running the totalitarian regime. They don't want the bully boys anymore, which, I think that's the difference between what happened in the early part of the 20th century to what's happening now in the early part of the 21st century.
That's interesting. Do you have much credence for the allegation that Hitler tagged socialism onto Nazism just to get workers to go along with what he was?
I'm not an expert. I don't know much about it, and anything I do say will probably be, twisted and turned and made controversial.
And used against you
at a later date. Yeah. So I'll say no comment. No. Yeah. I don't know for sure. It's called the National Socialist Workers' Party, wasn't it? Yeah. And it existed previous to Hitler's regime, and they were convinced it was socialism. I've read a lot of quotes saying that it was a socialist.
Because lefties go nuts if you say that.
Of course.
The Nazis were lefties. No, they weren't. They were fascists. And that's the opposite. How is it the opposite?
You're talking about fascism. You're talking about Mussolini, aren't you? Because the Germans weren't fascists. They were National Socialists. Different definition. And Mussolini, he was a member of the Communist Party for 25 years.
Yes.
And he was the editor of a communist newspaper in Italy for 20 years.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then he transitioned from a communist into his version, which was fascism. Now, I don't know anything about fascism. I don't know, other than that little nugget.
Well, nobody really knows much about fascism because I've been looking for a cohesive definition of what fascism is and what it isn't for years. And
it's circular reasoning. Yeah. It's like you go, you're a fascist. Okay, what's a fascist? It's a racist. Well, what's a racist? You're a Nazi. What do you mean I'm a Nazi? What's a Nazi? A Nazi's a fascist.
Yeah.
No one's got a definition. It just goes round in circles.
Yeah. And it seems to be like a case of saying, I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay. Yeah. It's a bit vague. Yeah. It's
what are your thoughts on that? Well, what do you think is the definitions of that? What do you think that the National Socialists of Germany were socialists?
Again, I kind of think it's bullshit. I think a lot of people who show up saying I'm a capitalist don't really know what they're saying.
Yeah.
Or people who show up saying I'm a socialist, they don't really know what they're saying.
It's just a battle for power, isn't it?
It's a battle for power fundamentally.
Yeah.
If you want a revolution, you need men. And they should be young. It's better if they're not that bright. I would prefer that for my revolution. I don't want them questioning me. I want them young, dumb, motivated. I'm going to give them a gun and a uniform and say, that's your enemy. Do you want to be a good soldier? Yes, sir, I do. I'll give you a medal. Okie dokie. Go get killing. Do my bidding. It's like mafia work, isn't it? These are your, what do you call them? Button men.
Yeah.
So yeah, you would. How am I going to motivate people? I'm not going to say, "Oh, I'm the party of the elite," and I step on the faces of you and your family. Well, fuck you then. I'm going to kill you. No, I have to say, socialist workers. I'm for Germany. I'm for. You would. They always do this. I'm going to appeal to a historical version of what Germany used to be. I'm going to appeal to our cultural grievances against these people here, there, and everywhere. This is the new identity. This is what we're going to do. Yeah, I would say, I mean, I'm not a political expert, but by policy, when I looked it up, there's people saying, yes, by the strict dictionary definition, Nazis were socialists.
Yeah.
What they did was socialist. They were not kind. Mm-hmm. They were horrible version. They were also totalitarian.
But so was Soviet Russia. So the left and the right of the left.
Yeah.
is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
It's this big umbrella of the left. But within that, you've got a left and a right. And the Nazis are on the right of the left, and the Soviets for the left of the left.
And that's where, Soviets were the left of the left.
Of the left.
Yeah, the right of the left and the left of the left. This is where I think it's useful to get back to our definitions and be like, what do you, like, say if we had other people here, we largely agree, I think, but if you had somebody who's a hardcore socialist here, you'd have to say, what do you mean? And when we say left and right, I'm trying to stick to the French Revolution, left of the hall, right of the hall. If you were left of the hall, well, there wasn't a hall, the parliament, if it didn't always break down that way, but during the period of the French Revolution, if you moved to the left of the house, you were against the king, you were against the church, you were against the established authority. And if you were to the right of the house, you wanted to keep things the way they were.
That's interesting.
You liked the way things are. So therefore, and to this day I checked in the dictionary, if you're left, you must be a revolutionary, which is a very strange place to be. So you're actually not for stability.
No.
If you're a leftist...
Constant upheaval, isn't it?
Constant upheaval.
Yeah.
Unless you have your revolution and then swing right. Maybe that's the thing to do. But I think we all need to have a little bit of a new definitions, you said before. I would say, maybe there aren't any new definitions. You're either going to keep things the way they are. You're either going to change things or keep them. You either get to give your stuff to other people or you keep your own stuff. There probably aren't that many different ways of formulating it. But if you're on the right, conservative is you're conserving the status quo. On the left, you're fundamentally a revolutionary. Was Hitler a revolutionary? I would think
100%.
so. I mean,
Well, it's called Hitler's Revolution, isn't it?
It's Hitler's revolution. He's a revolutionary. There's clear socialism there. Statism and all the rest of it. But
I think it's mad though that we're still talking about Hitler and we're still talking about Stalin. It's like these guys are ancient history. You know, it's like, why are these two men are touchstones for everything else? It's like, I know it was a big event and I know a lot of things happened and it was a massive turning point in modern history, but it feels like it's so cliched now to
it is cliched. You're 100% right. But in kindness to us and other people who have to reach to Stalin and Hitler, we're still living it. It's not over.
No, you're right.
We're not the effing Hitler effect, the effing Stalin effect. You go Czech Republic, you go Albania, it's physically there. The statues are still there. The way we act now around nationalism and colonialism, all the guilt and the hand-wringing that goes on in this country, which is beyond pathological by my estimation, largely is informed by the war against
Well, it's the narrative. It's the communists won the war, didn't they?
Yes.
Right.
Oh God.
The communists won the war. Yeah.
No, America won the war, Laurence.
No. Well, the communists won the war, as far as I'm.
Which you mean the Stalinist communists?
The communists in America, the communists in Britain, the communists in Russia. I think generally they seem to be the dominant ideology right now, the dominant narrative.
Yeah.
You know, since the end of the war, you know, it's only gone further and further left and further and further towards Marx's ideals, isn't it? You know, so I think with that analysis, you could say that, you know, the communists won the war. Britain lost the war because our empire and our prestige and everything else that went with it, you know, was gone. You know,
we live in a country where if you fly the flag of the country, it's seen as a crime.
Well,
by some people.
You can fly the flag of Ukraine and be called a hero, but you fly the flag of Britain and you're called, you're a racist.
Which is bonkers.
Yeah,
and people.
Not that I support. I'm not a Union Jack.
No, but
it's the idea.
It's the idea is insane.
Yeah.
Like if you go to Malaysia and people fly Malaysian flags, you'd be like, racist lah. They would tell you to go fuck yourself, or try it in Uganda, or try it in Zimbabwe, or try it in literally any other country. But no, here.
So that tells you we're a defeated people.
A guilty people.
Yeah, but a guilty people is a defeated people, isn't it? Because, if you feel the need to apologize, or you feel the need, you've surrendered, right? So you've surrendered to whoever your ideological conqueror is, that you're having to say sorry.
Yeah.
For what? Something that happened centuries ago for our ancestors. I didn't even know if it happened at all, or who did it, or what. I just don't know. So, but it seems to me that collectively we're on our knees, literally, begging for forgiveness. And that's not the position of strength. That's the position of surrender. And we can see it with our national identity is gone, hasn't it? What does it mean to be English anymore? I don't even know.
No,
other than being a yob going to watch the English football, which is again probably manipulated to be that way.
Yes, I think to a degree that is true. There is a degree of manipulation in that, and when people ask me about being proud of being British or proud of this or proud of that, I'm like, no, I wasn't raised to be proud. I don't, as you just said, I don't even really know what that category is. I feel more proud of Europe. I'm proud to be European. I have feelings about Europe. Britain, I'm like, if Britain wipes its own arse and gets out of bed eventually and starts being a country that is proud of itself, then yeah, maybe, but it's not for me to be proud of the country I'm in when it has no self-pride and it's constantly whipping itself, berating itself, flagellating itself for historical crimes in a way that zero other country on earth fucking engages in. Why do we have to do it?
Yeah, no, it's embarrassing. It really is embarrassing.
It is embarrassing.
And I hope the period of humiliation comes to an end sooner rather than later, which brings me on to maybe something where we can transition to.
Yes.
We've been talking quite a lot about the past.
Yes.
And historical events that kind of led to the present, but let's talk about the future.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on where we're at? I spoke to Uber Boyo recently, brilliant Irish guy, and he's got a really unique take upon the world, and a lot of his ideas are through the lens and prism of young Nietzsche, and he's got quite a negative, depressing prescription of the future of the West. In a sense, he says it's already over. We're already being having our heads stomped collectively, culturally, consciously, and we just have to kind of wait to see what the next formation of our civilization is going to be. What's your take on that?
I was in a podcast with a group of Irish lads. It's NBR. And I spoke to Uber Boyo for the first time, and he has a very good and deep grasp of Nietzsche, particularly. And yes, his views are pessimistic, realistic. I think he's got that. I think he's grasped the Nietzschean spirit of cutting through the debate to the key points. And I think I would concur with his view and Nietzsche's view that there's only so much you can do with words and talking about it and your ideologies and everything else. It's all pretty impotent at the point where you're like trying to talk your way out of a problem that you've acted your way into. It is too late. It's been too late, probably since before we were born. I didn't used to believe that until recently. But as I look back now, I can see the karmic weight, the inertia that we would post-World War II, I think that's what you need to look to. World War II, how that was resolved, the fear before it, the nightmare that we lived through, the real horror of potentially being invaded and taken over or having to
speak German.
And, and that wasn't, there were people preparing to fight off Germans on the South Coast. We were not ready for that war. We really weren't. So there was terror, genuine terror. Plus our cities were being bombed. Liverpool here was being bombed. Terrifying time. And I think we prayed for a fast resolution. The resolution that we got, I think, wasn't great. As you say, the communists won. But when you're terrified, I guess you just go for what you can. Europe definitely lost. I mean, whole swathes of Europe were just handed over to we said we don't like lunatic, mass murdering fanatics. That's why we're fighting this war. Oh, but by the way, Europe, we're handing you over to a lunatic fanatic.
Well, we went to war because Poland was invaded.
Yeah.
We risked all of our lives and treasure because Poland was invaded. But yeah, at the end of the war, we handed it over to the Russians.
It's and it's really a disgrace. It's so sad. I mean, Poland, as an example, for a time occupied both by the Nazis and by the Russians, and the barbarity they faced at the hands of both. Generally, they say the Russians were worse. The discipline for things like punishments for rape and for theft apparently was worse amongst the Russians. But whatever, they were occupied by two extremely aggressive, extremely hostile invading forces.
With extreme ideologies.
With insane ideologies. And that there's trauma there. There's trauma in Albania. There's trauma in Romania. It's not over. That's why I say we have to keep. It is cliche to go on about it, but it ain't over. Our European brothers and sisters still live.
Well, look at Ukraine. Ukraine. There seems to be a war over the Nazification of
it's
Ukraine.
Incredible. It's incredible. It's like, I have weird nightmares about this, where ghost soldiers are appearing on terrains that you thought were long finished battlefields, and they're back again. In all seriousness, a guy who is probably the wealthiest man in the world, certainly in charge of one of the largest superpowers in the world, is in sincerity talking about the danger of Nazis on his borders. And I'm like, I can't cope. We just hit the pandemic.
But the thing is with Russia, though, it's like the Russian narrative, in the way that the British narrative of the Second World War had been a victory cult, and we all get around this idea of winning the Second World War. Well, the Russians have one similar. They lost scores of millions of people in the war, and their narrative is that it was a war against the Nazis, it was a war against the fascists. So it's quite easy for Putin to whip up support in a war against the Nazis on their doorstep, which we see with the Azov Battalion, who almost feel like they're LARPing as Nazis, with the crazy tattoos and stuff like that. But there is a historical nature of historical precedent of Ukraine with the Nazification going back to the Second World War, and that's a bit of a legacy from it. But it doesn't feel like it was the whole country being Nazified.
No, I think it's an insane accusation. And yes, the neo-Nazis, I mean, I've spoken to people who are ex-neo-Nazis. I was friends for a while who was in the regiment that grew out of the Ustasi in Croatia. And I would say to him, like, what do you think of neo-Nazis? What do you think of the neo-Nazi movement in America? He said, most of this is bullshit. Yeah. He said, it's gone. Like, it was a But
it's a good propaganda tool, isn't it? For nations that still have the Nazi bogeyman as part of their mythic history, as part of their national identity, for them to be able to, drum up, a little bit of...
Well, you could, isn't it interesting? You couldn't do that here. You couldn't say to the Brits, we're going back to get rid of the Nazis. We would laugh. The Russians are not laughing. And I'm like, what? Are you taking this seriously? You really think?
Or maybe they don't really think it. Maybe they think it's cover, for Western. Because what can the West say to the Russian argument that we're going against the Nazis? Because that's the foundation of modern Western, revisionism, isn't it? Is that this whole thing is, a constant struggle, especially with the communists. It's a constant struggle against fascists under the bed.
Yeah.
So with the Russians saying it's against the Nazis, it kind of in some ways neutralizes the propaganda effort from the West in order to counter it.
Which that yet again shows us how far back in history we really are.
It's mad, isn't it? We go back again.
We're nowhere near as progressed as we thought we were. And no, I don't. I think you're asking me if I personally think there is a Nazi threat in Ukraine. No, I don't. Yeah. I think, though, we should have a proper conversation about corruption, nationalism, human rights abuses, violence. I mean, Ukraine is no picnic. Nope. I mean, I would not want to get stuck there. I wouldn't want to get stuck in any war zone. But the way we're talking about Ukraine and Ukrainians is it's hyper sentimentalized, and it's really not helpful. No. It really isn't realistic, and it's not helpful at all. It didn't just start. This is its own country with its own problems. I mean,
Because you've got quite a bit of experience in Eastern Europe, haven't you? You travelled quite extensively, and you stay over there quite a lot.
I just gave £1,200 to a mate of mine to fucking. It's tragic to drive. She's in Prague, and she only has one apartment. And her mother came over from Ukraine when the war started, and her mother is crying every day for her father. And her father can't leave because he's still of fighting age. And the mother says, "Drive me back." So I say to her, M, her name is M, code name M. What are you going to do? And she says, "I'm going to drive from Prague in my shit car and take my crying mother back into a war zone because she misses her dad." And I was like, well, the least I can do is pay for the fuel and food and stuff. It's horrible. It's her successful journey was taking her mother back into a war zone. I'm looking at the possibility of going to Kiev.
Kiev or Kiev.
It's Kiev. You filthy Russian sympathizer, you Putin fanboy. Kiev, the Ukraine. I mean, is that
the Zelensky definition? Is it, or the Zelensky pronunciation?
Kiev. The Ukrainian pronunciation is Kiev. Forget your chicken Kievs. They do not exist anymore. You're having chicken Kievs for dinner tonight.
But it's funny, isn't it? We tried to transition to the future. You know, we got as far ahead as the war in Ukraine, and we went all the way back to the Second World War again.
Because we really didn't escape, and this is just like psychology. It's all trauma.
Yeah,
we're still living in our past. We're like the nation.
Collective trauma, isn't it?
Collective trauma. We never got over it. We all have these.
How would we get over it collectively? Is there something we can do consciously, or would it be a catalyst in events that would cause something like that?
Well, bringing it back to Uberboyo and Nietzsche, I think like. The emphasis, from what I understood from where he wasn't really talking to me, he was talking to a panel. You've got slave morality and you've got master morality. Master morality, everybody says there's no Nietzsche's not saying one's better than the other. I'm like, I'm not sure about that. It's pretty clear where the problems of slave morality are. Master morality could become sadistic and dominating and awful. But slave morality makes a virtue of being a victim. No. Not anymore. Guys, come on. We've run this experiment for decades. It's fucking awful.
But wouldn't you say that at the moment being a victim is profitable?
100%.
Yeah, so while people are making money collectively and from an ideological perspective from being victims, that's never going to go away, is it?
So what you've done is you've said collectively, isn't it beneficial? Yes. We have so many weak people now. That they all want to hide in a collective and they want to be rewarded from the top down.
For being weak.
For being weak. They want mummy and daddy to give them reparations or rewards or something. I hate this.
Yeah.
It's unadulterated weakness. It corrupts everyone.
Totally.
It corrupts the recipient, it corrupts the transmitter, and our whole environment is corrupted in that. We must move back to something. We must reject the slave morality and go back to a master morality mode. We could do that consciously, but we won't. And I think, again, it's kind of a Nietzschean, maybe Jungian idea. We have we the people. What is we the people? That's the mass of people who want to move in a certain direction. Where are they going? Can we stop them? No. So I'm pessimistic. No. Why do we have racism? Because people like racism. Why do we have this absurd narrative around the war in Ukraine? Because that's what people want. They're jerking themselves off on Instagram and Facebook, pretending to be something that they're not. They don't realize the damage they're doing. They've no idea how much damage they're doing when they spin the narrative in a certain way. Let me be clear, I'm not for the invasion of Ukraine. My God, I think it's barbaric.
Yeah.
It's totally unacceptable. Nations are sovereign.
It's none of our business though, really, is it?
Which was the point I was going to make earlier. Yeah. Ukraine has its own problems. Has it been working balls out since the year 2000 to now to resolve its own shit? No. What's it been doing? Stealing from the fucking people. Tell me I'm lying. It's utterly fucking corrupt. I just come from Serbia.
It's one of the most corrupt nations on earth.
Right.
And we're told that we've got a cost of living crisis in this country. Yet we're sending billions to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Why?
Yes. So what I would say is this is back to the sort of when in Nietzsche, master morality and slave morality. Nietzsche used the term morality. It probably would be better translated as a philosophy.
Okay.
Do you have a master philosophy or a slave philosophy? We're operating from a slave philosophy. This is a lack of a good philosophy. We should be way more decisive than this. We should be much, much stronger than this and say, no, here are our boundaries. This is what we will help you with. This is what we won't help you with. This is what we have an agreement for, what we don't have an agreement for. Everything is so wet and weak and wishy-washy from the top down. There's no adults in the room.
I don't think this form of democracy that we have now is going to lead us out of this malaise either.
No. There's no future in this.
No.
What we're doing right now, so Slavoj Žižek wrote the book Living in the End Times, I think it was 10 years ago. Maybe it was a little bit longer than that. And he's 100% right. And his main point was the way we live now cannot continue.
No.
So I can guarantee you these are the end times of this permutation of civilization. At this point, I'd rather get it over with.
Well, Anthony Michels, who, he's got a really, really good understanding of finance, economics, and banking and stuff. And he says we're on a trajectory at the moment of this debt bubble. Right? It's something like 100 trillion that it's gone like that, and then and he said it cannot continue.
Yeah.
Is that countries are having to produce something like 8 trillion every year in order to maintain this debt bubble, to stop everything from collapsing.
Yeah.
But that's going to hit a point where they cannot sustain it any longer.
Yeah.
And then this crazy cycle of inflation that we're in at the moment, this insane cycle of inflation, which, as we discussed, is just them pumping more money into the economy. That's all it is.
Yeah.
The only way that they can solve that problem is deflation. And deflation is when it really hurts us, because that's when they start pulling money out of the economy and it crashes and we've got no money to spend.
Yeah.
And I think, I think that may be the opportunity, because what he argues is that we do not want these ups and downs, these booms and busts, which are manipulated by the banks. We need a steady finance, a steady economy. But this current malaise we find ourselves in politically, culturally, and spiritually, it doesn't seem no change is going to happen on the way up of this current. It's only going to be on the way down.
Oh, and
when it crashes, or after the aftermath, and we pick up the pieces, and then maybe it's
because we'll stop having the stupid conversations that we've been having and worrying about the stupid things we're worrying about, like fucking pronouns, or sex education in schools for 8-year-olds to learn about trans ideology. I mean,
sounds a bit old, 8 for their ideology. It's more
actually, it should be
4, isn't it?
4. Otherwise, they could be corrupted by the
capitalist patriarchy.
Yeah, exactly. And all this heterosexual nonsense that they'll learn. Disgusting. Heterosexuals, you make me sick. That will all end.
Yeah.
That will all end.
In a flash. Because once that's not propped up by the system, by the fake economy, then there'll be no support for any of it from society, from any shape or form.
I am a pessimist in this regard. What we have now cannot continue. I don't want it to continue.
Yeah.
I don't want it to. I'm not a supporter of this. I'm not a supporter of what we have now. But to be clear, our version of democracy, our version of banking, our version of running states and nations and everything else, do I have better ideas than that? Not really. Not without going back to Marx and some sort of sci-fi communism. Like one world governments and all the rest of it. We could run it differently. We could run it with more humility. We could insist on more personal responsibility. People don't want to look at, this is a very left-wing radical thing I'm going to say, the personal is the political. If you're pissed off that your government isn't taking responsibility and acting like an adult, look at how you in your own life are not taking responsibility and acting like an adult. All of us are doing this. Nobody's leaning in. Whereas in the previous generation, people thought collectively, not as collectivists. They were individuals who thought about the collective good, and they took care of each other. That's gone.
Yeah.
That's completely gone. We're totally weak. I hope that it collapses. I hope sooner rather than later.
Well, I think what we've seen is the constant march towards the centralization of power, whether it's through banking or through political unions or culturally, it's becoming more homogenous. Is that I think that the opposite needs to be applied, which is the decentralization of power back down to the individual units, the family, the parish, the town. We need to get autonomy at that level.
I agree with you, but why has power decentralized? So if something has happened,
why is it centralized?
Sorry, yes. What? Yeah, sorry.
Money.
I need another coffee. The will of the people has led us to that place. Why?
Money.
You think?
I think usury. Yeah, I think that if usury is constantly centralizing power through the accumulation of resources, the constant accumulation of resources, which is hoarded at the top, right? It's for instance, is it easier to collect a debt from 5 countries or 1 country?
I see.
Right. So by centralizing those 5 countries into a supranational union, the EU, the bankers only have to collect from one source.
Oh God, yeah. It makes sense for why the powers that be would want to centralize money and power itself. Why do people go along with it?
I don't. I just think it's our people suffer through our people perish through a lack of knowledge. Yeah. So I think it's just the cultural and constant attempts by the state to dumb us down and remove our ability to think critically. And the state schooling system and the Prussian education system, in which they inverted the way we learn in schools and universities. So I think that's one of the reasons, but it doesn't really answer the question, does it? Why do we go along with it? Because we are more than a biological machine, in my view. We are much more than a biological machine. So why is our spirit allowing us to be so repressed and not fighting for truth, justice, and freedom?
Exactly. And your analysis of why we've gone along with this is kind. Mine is cruel. It's cruel. I'd say people are weak, and they're lazy, and they're comfort-seeking, and that's okay. There's a biological drives to be weak, lazy, and comfort-seeking, but we must overcome them. What used to give us the strength to overcome? Philosophy, religion, and spirituality.
And harsh conditions.
Harsh conditions make you reach for philosophy, religion, and spirituality. Because you're like, why am I suffering? Oh, God, is there a God? Do I ever feel closer to God? Sometimes when I fast. Sometimes when I pray. When I follow this practice. When I don't drink. When I do this. When I do... And you're seeing like little twitches of that religious instinct coming back. This whole no-fap movement. Would you believe 10 years ago, men online would get together in groups to talk about the fact that they don't wank?
No.
And tell each other
I still can't entertain a weird conversation,
And the same dudes take cold showers, and the same dudes run
It's aesthetic, isn't it?
It's an aesthetic modality. Yeah. I think that's where,
because what it's doing there is actually, sorry to interrupt you, is we talked about men need to suffer in order to, really understand life. And because our society has removed a lot of the suffering for survival, is that man is imposing it upon himself in order to grow as a man.
So I think it's a positive instinct. It's dorky and it's weird and it's awkward. But men and women must suffer in order to grow, in order to attain some sort of enlightenment. What I'm talking about fundamentally is, I think the Greeks it would have been the Vedics. Okay, but let's say the Greeks identified we have to overcome our base instincts. We can't just do whatever we want to do at any moment in time. We can't just be this raw bag of id and ego that drinks and eats and screams and runs around the streets shagging and puking and eating kebabs. Well, we can, but where do we end up? Whilst we're doing that, people who are smarter than we are will go, would you like to give away some of your responsibility? Yeah, the fucking would. You take care of that for me, lad. Just hand it over here. Don't worry, we'll do this for you. And it's statism. 100%. It's authoritarianism. Yeah. I don't want to do it. Let somebody else do it for me. We're abrogating our responsibility daily, second by second, day by day, with the choices that we make. Aestheticism, as you said, that impulse to religion, spirituality, discipline, it's an effort to say no. It's a restraint from the animal to the human. Remember in Dune, Paul Atreides, when he was tested with the Gom Jabbar, puts his hand in the box, and the woman, the Ben Gesserit witch, says, the animal in you will tell you to pull your hand out. I want to know if you're a human, because the human will leave his hand in the box of terrible pain. It's an illusion. It's faking that your hand is burning. It's not really. Can you have the discipline to be a human? That's what we're being asked now. This is like a Gom Jabbar test for the whole of humanity.
It's funny you should bring up Dune, because it's a good analogy, Dune. Is, I think this mechanistic worldview is ultimately what's responsible for the current malaise that we're in right now.
100%.
And in Dune, the backstory to Dune is that it's 3,000 years into the future, isn't it? Humans have left Earth and have populated the other planets in the galaxy. But there was a great war that happened, and it was a war between AI.
Yes, the Butlerian jihad.
And there was a law made after humans won that war, which said that they can no longer have any form of AI or computers ever again.
Brilliant.
And that's when they developed their psychic abilities, didn't they, with the voice and the, you know, the what is it they do? You know, he screams or something and controls the worms.
Yes.
You know,
there's instead of having computers, they have humans who are highly trained and traumatized from birth to fragment their minds, and they take drugs so they can think faster. I can't remember.
But it seems to me as if Frank Herbert had the epiphany or the vision to see where we're heading.
And to go beyond. Brilliant. Genius.
Genius. And I think, because that's the thing about the mechanistic worldview, is that more and more scientists, true scientists, the deeper they look into creation, the more mystical they become. Because they realized is that there is no final definition. We cannot tell you what matter is. The deeper we look, the more difficult it becomes for us to define what is the essence of the universe.
Because they're at the edges of our simulation. It's like when you play Call of Duty and you run to a wall that hasn't been programmed, and you just stare at the wall and you're running at the wall and it's just pixels. So what's the smallest thing here? No, that's it.
Well, Niels Bohr said, you know, as we've mechanistic worldview is the dominant ideology currently in the West today, is that it's built upon numbers and statistics. In the belief, the false belief that numbers are infallible, that it's data that's infallible. But Niels Bohr, the brilliant quantum physicist, said that the deeper you go into creation, into the universe, into the subatomic level, the only language that you can use to describe the universe is poetry and metaphor. Not number.
But he believed in the simulation theory as well.
Really, he went. You know, he was the deeper he went, he realized, you know, this journey that took us away from God at the beginning of the Enlightenment ultimately has led us back there, because we can't prove jack shit. I mean, that, you know, he'd even go far as to say there is no absolute truth. You know, as far as our perception can decide.
Which is fascinating. You start to re-enter non-dualism.
Amazing stuff. I love all that. And I think that is the potential future for us, is that if we can defeat this mechanistic worldview that we are nothing and that we're just specks in a, you know, grand accident, which the creation myth of the Big Bang, you know, tries to blag us with.
You'll be there in the sort of the skeletal remains of Liverpool after the nuclear bomb. There'll be no Netflix, there'll be no 4K pornography, and you'll build a little campfire and you'll eat some rats with other survivors, and you can tell them all about this, and they will want to know. They will, at that point, they'll be like, fucking hell, we should have listened before the bomb went off, you know, like, should have done something about this, you know, kid, because by then it will be too late. But it will bring us back. It will bring us back to, I think Brett Weinstein makes this point numerous times. We are not a good evolutionary match for this environment, and it shows. We're not happy like this. We are the victims of our own success. All this technology, all this progress, the Enlightenment, the Western mechanistic view, we're fragile, religious, superstitious creatures that belong out on the plane. We need danger. We need risk. We have to hunt. We have to lose. We have to win. And we need gods and goddesses and visions and dreams. That's
the human experience that's been taken away from us.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this up now because we're running out of time. But so tell us a bit what you're doing now. You wrote a book.
Yeah, I wrote a book. It's coming out in middle of August. It's called A Cult of One.
Wow.
It's about my experiences growing up. It's got like psychedelic experiences in there, fight stories in there, sex stories in there. Lots of
your memoir.
Originally it was just going to be talking about narcissistic abuse and how to overcome codependency. And I submitted at the beginning of the pandemic a book of 80,000 words, and these nice American publishers were like, "This is a fascinating book. It's kind of boring." It's like, fucking hell, you cheeky bastards. So they wanted to cut it in half. And they said people really need a human story.
What your story?
So it's half. So
you're weaving your personal story with your understanding of narcissism and how it applies to you and everybody else.
Yeah. So it's a bit more human. It's
Cult of One.
Cult of One, it's called.
Where did the title come from? That's a great title.
It was between myself and they have people there who are specialists who you talk things through with. Because we had the original title that I wanted, it was going to be called Just an Echo, which is a reference to Narcissus and Echo and the nature of codependency. And again, I got the quiet, polite American response. That's kind of boring.
At least they're honest.
Yeah. So we wanted something a bit more dramatic.
And when's that coming out?
Mid-August, 2022.
Mid-August, okay. Yeah. I look forward to that. I look forward to reviewing it with you.
Yeah, happy days.
And what else are you up to? You're travelling quite a bit?
I'm travelling quite a bit. I'm doing a lot of interviews with people. I'm not sure why. I have a very strong impulse at the moment to talk to people, to have conversations like this. It keeps me sane.
Yeah. Because it's going really well. Your channel is that you've done about 5 interviews so far. I was one of them.
You were one of them,
which was great. I really enjoyed it. How's that going?
It's great.
Strength to strength.
People keep asking me what you're doing it for, and I'm like, I feel just like compelled. I just feel like I don't know. Maybe the end of the world is soon, and I don't know. And it's my last will and testament. There's certain people who want to at least have a voice and have that conversation with them, so it's out there, so I can say, okay, I did that before whatever happens, before I go to Kyiv and get shot in the head.
Okay, good. I hope that doesn't happen anyway. But so if people want to find you, where can they find you?
The best place to look for me would be richardgrannon.com.
richardgrannon.com. Okay, mate. Well, listen, it's been a great pleasure and really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks.
Until the next one.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Cheers.